July is the month that decides whether your garden holds together for the rest of summer or starts falling apart. Heat is at its peak, plants are working overtime to produce flowers and fruit, and pests are more active now than at almost any other point in the growing season. A single week of neglect here does more damage than the same week in April or May, because plants under summer stress have almost no buffer left. A bed that isn't watered deeply enough for 10 days might look fine on day 3, and then wilt hard on day 10. A few aphids on one stem can turn into a full infestation across an entire vegetable row before anyone notices. Small mistakes made this month tend to snowball fast, and by the time they're obvious, some of the damage is already done. Gardeners who stay ahead of it now are usually the ones still harvesting healthy tomatoes and pulling weeds out of thriving flower beds come September. What follows are 10 specific things worth doing to your garden this month, based on how plants actually respond to summer heat and stress, not generic advice recycled straight from a spring planting guide. Quick note before the list. If practical, no-fluff gardening advice like this is useful to you, subscribing means you won't miss the next one, which matters heading into fall planting season when timing actually decides whether your crops make it before the first frost. Now, into the list. Most home gardens need somewhere around 1 to 1.5 inches of water a week during peak summer, counting rainfall, and the way that water gets delivered matters almost as much as the amount. Watering deeply 2 or 3 times a week trains roots to grow further down into the soil, where moisture stays available even during a hot stretch. Watering lightly every single day does the opposite. It keeps roots shallow and close to the surface, which is exactly the layer of soil that dries out fastest in July heat. The best time to water is early morning, generally before 9, so the water has time to soak into the root zone before the sun gets intense, and any water left on the leaves has time to dry off before evening, which lowers the risk of fungal problems overnight. A soaker hose or drip line at the base of the plant puts water where roots can actually use it, while an overhead sprinkler in the middle of a hot afternoon loses a good portion of that water to evaporation before it ever reaches the soil. A simple way to check whether it's actually time to water is pushing a finger about 2 inches into the soil near the base of the plant. If it still feels damp at that depth, the roots likely have enough to work with, and if it feels dry and crumbly, that's the signal to water deeply, rather than sticking to a fixed schedule regardless of conditions. A 2 to 3 inch layer of organic mulch, whether that's shredded bark, straw, or compost, does 3 jobs at once during July heat. It slows down how fast moisture evaporates from the soil surface, which means less frequent watering and more consistent moisture for the roots underneath. It keeps soil temperature more stable so roots aren't sitting in soil that's been baking in direct sun all day, and it blocks light from reaching weed seeds near the surface, which cuts down on the weeds competing with your plants for water and nutrients in the first place. The one thing to watch is keeping mulch pulled back a couple of inches from plant stems and tree trunks, since mulch piled directly against a stem holds moisture against the bark and can invite rot or give pests an easy place to hide. Straw and shredded leaves tend to work well around vegetable beds since they break down over the season and add organic matter back into the soil, while bark mulch holds up longer around perennial beds and shrubs where it doesn't need to be replaced every few months. Once a flower fades, the plant's next move is usually to put energy into producing seeds from that spent bloom. Removing the flower before that happens redirects the plant's energy back into producing new blooms instead. This works especially well on repeat bloomers like roses, zinnias, marigolds, cosmos, dahlias, and salvia, all of which will keep flowering through summer if they're deadheaded regularly instead of left to go to seed. Use clean scissors or pruners rather than pinching with your fingers on woodier stems, and cut just above a leaf node or a new bud so the plant has somewhere to direct that redirected energy. Skipping this step for even a couple of weeks in July is often the difference between a flower bed that keeps blooming into September and one that quietly stops by the end of the month. On roses specifically, cutting back to a stem with 5 leaflets rather than 3 tends to produce a sturdier new flower, and it's worth noting that a handful of plants, like most peonies and lilacs, bloom once per season and don't need deadheading for more flowers, though removing the spent blooms still keeps the plant looking tidy and puts its energy into root and foliage growth instead. July is peak activity season for aphids, spider mites, and squash bugs, and across much of the country, it's also when Japanese beetles emerge and stay active clear through August. These pests do most of their early damage on the undersides of leaves, which is exactly the spot most gardeners forget to check when they're just glancing at a plant from a few feet away. Catching an infestation when it's a few dozen insects on 1 or 2 plants is manageable. Catching it after it's spread across an entire bed is a much bigger job, and by then some of the damage to the plant is permanent. For many home gardens, insecticidal soap handles aphids and mites effectively, and for Japanese beetles, simply hand-picking them into a bucket of soapy water each morning keeps their numbers down without reaching for anything stronger. Ladybugs and lacewings are natural predators of aphids, so a garden with a few flowering plants nearby to attract them often needs less intervention than one that's just rows of vegetables with nothing else around, and neem oil is a reasonably gentle option for broader pest problems that isn't as hard on beneficial insects as most synthetic pesticides. Zucchini, cucumbers, green beans, and tomatoes all share the same basic pattern. The more consistently you harvest them, the more they keep producing. Letting fruit sit on the plant past its peak signals the plant to slow down new fruit production and shift its energy toward maturing the seeds inside whatever's already there. That's the biology behind the common complaint about zucchini plants suddenly slowing down in late July, when the real cause is usually a few oversized zucchini left on the vine too long. Checking productive plants every 2 to 3 days during peak season is enough to stay ahead of this, since a zucchini in particular can go from perfectly sized to oversized within about 48 hours in the middle of summer. Green beans follow a similar pattern. Beans left on the vine too long turn tough, and the plant shifts toward producing fewer new pods, so picking them while they're still slender keeps both the quality of the harvest and the plant's output higher through the rest of the season. By July, a lot of the nutrients from spring feeding or from the original potting soil have already been used up, especially by heavy feeders like tomatoes, peppers, and squash, all of which are now putting serious energy into producing fruit. Side dressing with a balanced fertilizer, or working compost into the top few inches of soil around the base of the plant, restocks the nutrients these plants need for the fruiting push that happens through the rest of summer. Container plants need this more urgently than plants growing in the ground, since frequent watering in containers washes nutrients out of the potting mix much faster than it does in garden soil. Skipping this step doesn't usually kill a plant, but it often shows up as smaller fruit, fewer flowers, or a noticeable slowdown in growth right when the plant should be at its most productive. Yellowing on the lower, older leaves while the newer growth stays green is a common early sign that a plant is running low on nitrogen and could use feeding sooner rather than later. Fish emulsion or compost tea are gentler organic options that work well for gardeners who want to avoid synthetic fertilizers, though they typically need to be applied more often than a slow-release granular feed. By mid-July, tomatoes loaded with fruit, dahlias in full bloom, and peonies carrying heavy flower heads are often carrying enough weight to snap their own stems, and that risk goes up significantly during a summer storm with wind and heavy rain. Cages, stakes, and trellises installed now give these plants something to lean on before that weight becomes a problem instead of after. It's a lot easier to tie a healthy stem to a stake than it is to try to save a stem that's already cracked or split under its own weight. This is also a good moment to check any supports installed back in spring, since a stake that was tall enough for a young plant in May can be several inches too short for the same plant now that it's fully grown. Soft ties like strips of cloth or dedicated garden tape work better than wire or tight string, which can cut into a stem as it thickens through the rest of the season and cause damage that opens the plant up to disease. Fall crops like broccoli, cabbage, and kale generally need somewhere around 8 to 10 weeks to reach maturity, which means seeds started now still have enough time to produce a harvest before the first frost in most temperate regions. Root vegetables like carrots and beets can often be direct sown into the ground in mid to late July for a fall harvest as well, since they tend to handle the cooling temperatures of early fall better than the heat of midsummer anyway. The seed packet is the fastest way to plan this out. It lists the days to maturity for that specific variety, and counting backward from the average first frost date for your area tells you whether there's still time to plant it now or whether it needs to wait until next spring. Fast-maturing crops like lettuce and radishes are a good filler option too, since they're often ready in a month or less, and tucking them into a spot with a bit of afternoon shade helps them handle the last stretch of summer heat before conditions cool down. Powdery mildew and several other common fungal diseases thrive in one specific combination of conditions: high humidity paired with still, stagnant air, and July delivers exactly that combination in most climates. Watering at the base of the plant instead of overhead keeps foliage dry, which removes one of the main conditions fungi need to take hold and spread. Giving plants enough space for airflow between them does the same thing by keeping humid air from sitting trapped around the leaves. If a few leaves already show the telltale white powdery coating, Removing them promptly and disposing of them away from the compost pile keeps a small, contained problem from spreading to the rest of the bed, which is a much harder situation to recover from once it takes hold. Inconsistent watering plays into a related problem too. Blossom end rot on tomatoes and peppers, that dark, sunken patch on the bottom of the fruit, is usually tied to a plant's difficulty absorbing calcium during swings between very dry and very wet soil, which is one more reason steady, deep watering matters as much as it does. During a heat wave, especially stretches of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, plants can go into heat stress even when the soil underneath still has plenty of moisture. It shows up as wilting in the middle of the day, scorched or crispy leaf edges, and flowers or young fruit dropping off the plant entirely, as the plant redirects its limited resources toward survival instead of growth. Shade cloth that blocks somewhere between 30 and 50% of direct sunlight, draped temporarily over the most vulnerable plants during the hottest hours of the day, prevents a lot of this damage without permanently blocking the light they still need. It's also worth holding off on fertilizing or doing any heavy pruning during a heat wave itself, since both add extra stress to a plant that's already working hard just to cope with the temperature. Watering deeply the evening before a forecasted heat wave gives roots a reserve to draw from once temperatures climb, which tends to work better than trying to catch up with water once the plant is already showing signs of stress in the middle of a 90-degree afternoon. That covers 10 things worth doing to your garden this month, and none of them require a complete overhaul. Just consistent attention while the heat is at its highest. Water deeply instead of often. Keep mulch topped up, stay ahead of pests before they spread, and don't let harvest-ready vegetables sit too long on the vine. Get those basics right in July, and the plants that make it through this month tend to carry that momentum straight into a strong fall garden. If this kind of practical, season-specific advice is useful to you, subscribing means the next one, on fall planting timing, shows up in your feed right when you'll actually need it.